This is the second of 4 videos. We're looking at John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. In the first video, I raised the question of who, if anyone, is in control in this world. Is the world dominated by simply the exercise of human free will? Is man in charge largely? If man is in charge, can we trust God? On the other hand, is God sovereignly in control? Is he directing everything? Is this a movie being played out and we're nothing more than just actors following a script? If that's the case, could our lives really have any meaning? And how could we be held responsible by God for our actions? These are very important questions for us to consider, not just in a theological sense, but very practically. In John 19, verses 1 through 16, which I'm about to read for you, Jesus' public ministry has ended. He was arrested, he had been tried, and he had been sentenced by the Jewish leadership to death. They had taken him to Pilate for him to crucify Jesus. And so that's where we've come in to what's happening here is Jesus is before Pilate and he's being tried. The Jewish leadership, as you'll see, is prompting him, pushing him to crucify Jesus. Now, I want you to act as kind of like a jury and look at the text as the police report about what happened. And the question that I'm asking you as the jury to decide or to consider is exactly who murdered Jesus. I'll act kind of as the prosecutor after I've read the police report or the text and point out the chief suspects and why they are suspects. Let me read the text for you. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Here are the prime suspects: the Jewish leaders, Pilate, and I think we should need to even consider Jesus in his own death. First, the Jewish leaders. Of course, they did not literally kill them, according to the account, but certainly they orchestrated his killing. They had taken him to Pilate. They were clearly pressing him. And it almost comes across as if it's a crime syndicate or a mob boss trying to orchestrate or hiring a hitman to take out someone who he feels threatened by. That's what we see happening here. Certainly they're culpable. What was the motive for what they were doing? Certainly there was some self-centeredness, their power, their position. They felt threatened by Jesus. But at least according to the text, they were sadly misguided. Their motive, at least perhaps they thought, was not so nefarious. They believed, according to their testimony, they were doing God's will. According to the law that they followed, Jesus had committed blasphemy, and the punishment that they deemed appropriate for that blasphemy was death. The second suspect to consider is Pilate. Now he says he finds no basis for executing Jesus. He acts as if this is no matter to him, just a small business matter. But what we find is, in fact, it is a personal matter for him. He has doubts. He has fears. But he pushes those aside. He becomes the trigger man for the syndicate. And Jesus himself says to Pilate that he is guilty. He is guilty of sin. Jesus said to him, "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Pilate is guilty of sin. The one who handed him over to Pilate, whether it be the Jewish leadership and or Judas, they are guilty of a greater sin. You see, Pilate did the wrong thing by not doing the right thing. Lastly, I think we need to consider Jesus. Now, Jesus, we know from the Gospels, a number of times prior to this, in his time with his disciples, told them that he, in fact, was going to fulfill the prophecies regarding the Son of Man, regarding the Son of God, regarding God's Messiah. For example, we're told that at one time he said to his disciples, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." In another place, he said he must hang on a tree, referring to crucifixion. Was Jesus just working it out so he could fulfill this prophecy? We know from his earthly ministry there were a number of times that he did especially provocative things in regard to the Jewish leadership to bring on his own murder. There were times where his life was threatened before. Once he was about to be stoned, another time he was about to be thrown off a cliff. Both of those times he was able to escape. Why not this time? In fact, the text tells us that he essentially cooperated with those who intended to take his life and crucify him, again in fulfillment of the prophecy. So did Jesus have some kind of death wish? Who murdered Jesus? Was it the Jewish leaders? Was it Pilate? Or was it even Jesus?